The Battle of the Bismarck Sea stands as one of the most consequential and instructive engagements of the Pacific War, a dramatic confrontation that not only reshaped the dynamics of the New Guinea campaign, but also demonstrated with stunning clarity the rising dominance of air power in modern warfare. Fought between March 2 and March 4, 1943, the battle unfolded against a backdrop of escalating strategic pressure on Japan, whose foothold in New Guinea had become increasingly fragile as Allied forces tightened their grip on airfields, coastlines, and supply routes. The Imperial Japanese Army, determined to reinforce and stabilize its position at Law, assembled a large convoy of transports and destroyers to carry thousands of soldiers, equipment, ammunition, and supplies across the treacherous waters of the Bismarck Sea. Japanese planners believed that a carefully timed dash, supported by weather concealment, fighter cover, and naval escort, could successfully deliver their reinforcements and shift the strategic balance in their favor. Yet what they did not fully grasp was how profoundly the Allies had transformed their operational doctrine, turning the skies over New Guinea into a lethal domain in which innovation, coordination, and relentless pressure left enemy ships with almost no chance of survival. At the center of this transformation stood the U.S. 5th Air Force under General George Kenney, whose teams of bomber crews, fighter pilots, and tactical planners had spent months analyzing Japanese convoy movements and perfecting new attack techniques tailored to the unique challenges of the region. Among these innovations, skip bombing, an aggressive low-level bombing method in which bombs were skimmed across the sea like stones to strike the sides of enemy ships, proved revolutionary. Combined with mast-height strafing attacks, high-altitude bombardment, and relentless reconnaissance, Allied air power evolved from a supporting arm of the ground campaign into the decisive instrument of maritime interdiction. The stage for the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was thus set not simply by the movement of ships, but by the convergence of strategy, technology, and the hard-earned experience of airmen determined to neutralize Japan's ability to sustain its distant garrisons. As the convoy left Rabaul and steered southward into waters increasingly dominated by Allied aircraft, every mile brought the Japanese closer not to reinforcement and victory, but to catastrophe. Allied reconnaissance aircraft, patrolling tirelessly over the Solomon and Bismarck Seas, spotted the convoy and tracked its progress with precision. This early detection allowed Kenney's forces to assemble a multi-layered attack plan that drew on heavy bombers, medium bombers, attack aircraft, fighters, and Australian Beaufighters, all operating in coordinated waves designed to overwhelm the convoy from above, at sea level, and across every angle of approach. When the attacks began, they were not only devastating but tactically groundbreaking. High-altitude B-17 flying fortresses disrupted formation and sowed chaos among the ships, while low-flying B-25 Mitchells swept in at terrifying speeds, skipping bombs directly into the hulls of transports and destroyers. Australian aircraft strafed decks, neutralizing gun crews and making evasive maneuvers nearly impossible. Within hours, the carefully protected Japanese convoy dissolved into smoke, fire, and sinking steel. What followed was even more controversial: the two-day pursuit in which Allied aircraft relentlessly attacked surviving vessels, rafts, and swimmers attempting to reach the coast of New Guinea. Though harsh, this pursuit reflected the brutal strategic reality of the campaign. Any surviving soldier who reached Law would strengthen Japanese resistance and prolong the grinding jungle war that had already claimed so many lives. By the end of the battle, Japan had lost 8 transports, 4 destroyers, and nearly all the 7,000 troops it intended to reinforce. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The destruction of the convoy crippled Japanese hopes of stabilizing their New Guinea positions, drastically weakening their ability to defend La, Salamoa, and the Huon Gulf. It emboldened Allied commanders, strengthened the momentum of subsequent offensives, and demonstrated conclusively that air power, not naval might, would determine the course of the Pacific War's next phase. The psychological impact was equally significant. For the Allies, particularly Australia, the victory was a powerful symbol of turning tide, proof that the Japanese advance could not only be halted but reversed. For Japan, it was a devastating shock, exposing vulnerabilities in their logistics, convoy protection strategies, and operational assumptions. The battle also resonated far beyond its immediate outcome. Historians frequently point to the Bismarck Sea as a defining example of how technological adaptation and tactical innovation can decisively alter the nature of warfare. The use of skip bombing and low-level attack runs would influence air tactics for the remainder of the war, while the vulnerability of ships to coordinated air assault foreshadowed later battles in which fleets were shattered not by surface engagements, but by aircraft launched from land and sea. In the broader narrative of World War II, the battle stands as a moment when the future of warfare became unmistakably clear. Control of the skies meant control of supply lines, troop movement, reinforcements, and ultimately the fate of entire campaigns. Today, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea endures as both a tactical masterpiece and a sobering reminder of the unforgiving nature of war. The waters that swallowed the Japanese convoy now lie quiet, but beneath their surface rest the remains of ships and soldiers whose loss shaped the trajectory of the Pacific War. The battle's legacy continues to be studied in military academies and histories, not merely as an episode of destruction, but as a testament to the power of innovation, intelligence, and strategic foresight. In early 1943, as the Pacific War entered its most precarious and transformative phase, the Japanese Imperial High Command faced an urgent dilemma that threatened the integrity of its entire defensive perimeter. The critical stronghold of WWII in New Guinea, already battered by months of attritional fighting, disease, and crushing shortages, was nearing collapse. Japanese units in the region, positioned to halt the Allied advance toward Rabaul and the inner defensive rings of the empire, were worn down to mere fragments of their former strength. Supplies could no longer flow freely, reinforcements were being destroyed before they reached the front, and the once formidable Japanese air presence had been weakened by constant Allied pressure. Yet the stakes demanded action. If WWII fell, Japan's entire position in eastern New Guinea would crumble, opening a direct path for Allied forces to threaten the Bismarck Archipelago and ultimately the Caroline Islands. It was within this precarious context that Japanese leadership made a fateful and desperate decision to launch a large-scale reinforcement convoy across waters now patrolled by an increasingly aggressive and technologically superior Allied air force. The plan that emerged was bold, risky, and ultimately shaped by the kind of wartime necessity that overrules careful calculation. The convoy would consist of 8 transport ships, escorted by 8 destroyers, tasked with ferrying nearly 7,000 troops and vital equipment from Rabaul to WWII. This reinforcement wave was expected to be the turning point for Japanese positions in New Guinea, restoring frontline divisions to fighting strength and enabling a renewed counteroffensive. Yet beneath the veneer of strategic determination, senior commanders were acutely aware that the waters south of New Britain and north of New Guinea had become a hunting ground for Allied reconnaissance aircraft, prowling B-24 Liberators, and newly coordinated strike forces operating from bases along the northern coast of Australia. The Japanese Navy debated whether the convoy should travel at night, hug the coastline, or rely heavily on fighter coverage, but even the most conservative estimates acknowledged an undeniable truth. To move such a large and vulnerable convoy in early 1943 was to wager the future of the New Guinea front on a single throw of the dice. For the Japanese army, the reinforcement of WWII was not simply a matter of logistical necessity. It was viewed as the last viable chance to stabilize a faltering campaign. Units stationed at Lai and Selamawa had been reduced by months of disease, primarily malaria, dysentery, and tropical fevers that had ravaged their ranks. Ammunition was running dangerously low, rations had become sparse and predictable, and morale had been eroded by relentless Allied air raids that struck supply dumps, bivouac areas, and command posts with increasing precision. Commanders at Rabaul insisted that failure to reinforce quickly would not only doom Lai, but allow the Allies to consolidate their hold on the region and push toward Madong, thereby completely severing Japan's ability to move men or material along the northern New Guinea coast. Yet while the urgency of reinforcement was clear, the route to Lai was now one of the most dangerous maritime corridors in the Pacific, patrolled from above and threatened from multiple angles. Still, the Army pressed the Navy to mount an escort operation substantial enough to push through any Allied interference, hoping that determination and speed would compensate for the strategic disadvantages they now faced. Meanwhile, within the naval hierarchy, reservations ran deep. Admiral Jinichi Kusaka and his staff understood that the convoy would be vulnerable the moment it left the protective umbrella of Rabaul's airfields. Although Japan still held strong air units at Rabaul, including veteran fighter squadrons, logistical strain, pilot fatigue, and shortages of fuel and spare parts had eroded their effectiveness. Protective fighter cover could be provided, but only intermittently and never in sufficient strength to guarantee safety across the entire journey. Radar, which had become a decisive tool for Allied air operations, remained limited in range and effectiveness for Japanese forces. Worse, Allied aircraft had begun employing new tactics, most notably skip bombing and low-level coordinated attacks that had proven devastating in recent battles. Naval commanders knew these developments well, but the Army's insistence and the strategic necessity of Lai's reinforcement forced them into a choice they would not have made under other circumstances. As debate turned into an order, the Navy resolved to allocate destroyers for escort duty, hoping speed and maneuverability would allow the convoy to outrun or outfight any Allied threat. As preparations intensified, the Japanese attempted to reduce the operational risks through a series of measures that reflected both ingenuity and desperation. The convoy's route was planned to take advantage of coastal shadows and what they believed were gaps in Allied air patrol coverage. Departing from Rabaul under the cover of darkness, the transports, loaded with troops from the 51st Division, would move in tight formation, flanked by destroyers arranged in a protective screen. The timing of the voyage was chosen to coincide with what Japanese intelligence assessed to be a period of reduced Allied reconnaissance flights, although this assessment was based on incomplete information and wishful thinking. Radio silence would be enforced to prevent detection, and spotter planes were to patrol ahead of the formation to identify threats. As an added measure, the Japanese hoped that bad weather would cloak the convoy for at least part of the journey, allowing them to slip past Allied surveillance and make landfall at Lai before the enemy could mount a coordinated attack. Despite these precautions, many officers recognized that the Japanese were relying as much on luck as on planning. The waters along the northern coast of New Guinea had become increasingly contested, and Allied intelligence had grown extraordinarily effective at tracking Japanese movements across the region. Broken communication codes and aerial reconnaissance networks allowed Allied commanders to anticipate convoy operations days in advance. Although Japanese planners remained unaware of the full extent of Allied insight, subtle clues, such as the sudden increase in reconnaissance aircraft sightings, suggested that the enemy was watching. Even still, the strategic calculus left no alternative but to proceed. Lai had to be reinforced, regardless of cost. If the convoy succeeded, Japan could stabilize the front for months. If it failed, the implications would be catastrophic. The soldiers chosen for the reinforcement effort were themselves acutely aware of the mission's stakes. Many had fought in China before being transferred to the Pacific and now found themselves thrust into a landscape of sweltering jungles, torrential rains, and an enemy whose air power ruled the skies. As they boarded the transports at Rabaul, the men carried not only rifles and supplies, but the weight of a mission that their superiors had described as essential to the survival of the New Guinea campaign. For many of these troops, the upcoming voyage felt like a final test, a moment where their endurance and loyalty would be measured against the unforgiving realities of modern war. Some wrote letters home, expressing both determination and apprehension, while others remained silent, focusing their thoughts on the immediate challenges ahead. The officers, attempting to maintain morale, spoke of turning the tide and achieving victory in New Guinea, though privately many questioned whether the convoy would ever reach its destination. As the final hours before departure passed, a somber determination settled over the fleet. The destroyers, sleek and deadly, repositioned themselves round the slower transports, their crews ready for a mission they understood could involve intense combat. The transports themselves, slow, heavily loaded, and lacking defensive capability, relied entirely on their escorts and the hope that the enemy would not detect them until it was too late. At Rabaul's airfields, fighter units received orders outlining their escort responsibilities, though the limitations of fuel, pilot fatigue, and the sheer distance involved made it clear that their protection would be intermittent at best. Radar, which had become a decisive tool for Allied air operations, remained limited in range and effectiveness for Japanese forces. Worse, Allied aircraft had begun employing new tactics, most notably skip bombing and low-level coordinated attacks that had proven devastating in recent battles. Naval commanders knew these developments well, but the Army's insistence and the strategic necessity of Lai's reinforcement forced them into a choice they would not have made under other circumstances. As debate turned into an order, the Navy resolved to allocate destroyers for escort duty, hoping speed and maneuverability would allow the convoy to outrun or outfight any Allied threat. As preparations intensified, the Japanese attempted to reduce the operational risks through a series of measures that reflected both ingenuity and desperation. The convoy's route was planned to take advantage of coastal shadows and what they believed were gaps in Allied air patrol coverage. Departing from Rabaul under the cover of darkness, the transports, loaded with troops from the 51st Division, would move in tight formation, flanked by destroyers arranged in a protective screen. The timing of the voyage was chosen to coincide with what Japanese intelligence assessed to be a period of reduced Allied. Dawn broke over northern New Guinea with a gray, muted glow as Allied reconnaissance crews prepared for what they knew would be another long day in the skies. For months, the airmen of the 5th Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force had been refining a complex aerial surveillance network designed to detect Japanese convoys the moment they left Rabaul. The Japanese had relied heavily on night movements, weather cover, and deceptive routing to conceal their operations, but Allied air crews had grown adept at reading cloud patterns, tracking wakes on the water, and interpreting subtle signs of enemy activity. By early March 1943, the system had become a finely tuned machine, one that would now be tested against the largest and most dangerous Japanese reinforcement convoy yet attempted. Every crew member, from seasoned reconnaissance pilots to newly assigned navigators, understood that the next 48 hours might decide the fate of the New Guinea campaign. The early morning air was heavy with humidity as B-24 Liberators lifted off from bases at Dobodura and Port Moresby, their engines thundering across the jungle. These long-range aircraft formed the backbone of the reconnaissance network, capable of scouring vast expanses of ocean from altitudes high enough to evade most enemy fighters. Meanwhile, Australian PBY Catalinas, slow, dependable, and remarkably persistent, took to the skies under the fading starlight, gliding toward their assigned patrol sectors. Each aircraft carried a crew trained to scan endlessly for the faintest shape or silhouette upon the sea. The Japanese had become increasingly skilled at disguising their ships with smoke, wake-minimizing tactics, and nighttime maneuvers, but Allied air reconnaissance doctrine called for methodical sweeps that left no stretch of water unexamined. As the morning haze dissolved into clear visibility, these aircraft began fanning outward across the Bismarck Sea, forming the first line of what would soon become an encircling net around the Japanese convoy. Back at Allied headquarters in Port Moresby, intelligence officers monitored incoming radio transmissions from the reconnaissance aircraft, marking sightings on large maps pinned to the walls. Over the preceding months, Allied cryptographers had broken key elements of Japanese military codes, granting them insight into troop movements and logistical plans. Although the Japanese continued to modify their communication practices, the Allies often intercepted enough information to deduce when a major operation was imminent. That week, fragments of intercepted messages, coupled with reports of heavy activity at Rabaul's airfields and docks, suggested that a large convoy would soon depart. While the exact timing and route remained uncertain, the strategic picture was clear. Japan intended to reinforce Leh, and the Allies were determined to stop them. Every reconnaissance crew in the air understood that they were not merely observers, they were the eyes of the entire Allied war effort in New Guinea. The reconnaissance flights that morning encountered shifting cloud banks over the Solomon Sea, remnants of a weather front that had formed overnight. For the Japanese, such conditions offered partial concealment. For the Allies, they posed a challenge. B-24 crews altered their altitude repeatedly, climbing above denser cloud layers before descending again to peer through the gaps in the cover. As the sun climbed higher, the clouds began to disperse, revealing broad expanses of open water. The first several hours produced only routine observations, small fishing vessels, drifting debris, and wide stretches of empty ocean. But at 10:15 a.m., one Liberator crew flying a wide arc to the northwest spotted thin columns of smoke rising in the distance. The navigator, peering through binoculars, confirmed the presence of multiple vessels steaming in tight formation. The crew radioed back a concise but electrifying message. A large Japanese convoy had been sighted northeast of Cape Gloucester, moving southwest at high speed. The hunt had officially begun. The moment the sighting report reached Allied headquarters, the room erupted into controlled urgency. Intelligence officers began assessing the convoy's likely route, calculating intercept points, and comparing the information against weather forecasts. Experienced analysts quickly concluded that the Japanese were following the route predicted days earlier, a coastal track that hugged the northern shore of New Britain before turning sharply toward Leh. This route offered the Japanese some protection as it forced Allied aircraft to operate at the edge of their range and limited the time available for attacks. Yet it also made the convoy predictable, a vulnerability that the Allies intended to exploit. Orders were immediately relayed to additional reconnaissance aircraft, instructing them to converge on the area and maintain continuous surveillance. The Japanese convoy, still unaware that it had been discovered, sailed steadily onward, its course now fully illuminated on Allied maps. As the hours passed, the reconnaissance shadow began to thicken. By early afternoon, multiple Allied aircraft were tracking the convoy from staggered altitudes, maintaining visual contact while avoiding direct engagement with Japanese fighters. The destroyers escorting the convoy fired sporadically at distant aircraft, attempting to drive them away, but the Allied crews remained disciplined and persistent. Their task was not to attack, but to observe, report, and ensure that the convoy remained under constant scrutiny. The Japanese, for their part, became increasingly aware that they had been detected. Reports from their spotter planes indicated unusually high Allied air activity, and the escort commanders ordered tighter defensive spacing. The destroyers adjusted their anti-aircraft readiness, and lookouts scanned the skies for any sign of an approaching strike. The tension aboard the Japanese ships grew palpably as the realization spread that the Allies were preparing for something significant. Back at Allied bases, bomber crews began scrambling their aircraft, preparing for the possibility of launching attacks later that day or the following morning. But the key to the entire operation remained reconnaissance. Every minute that the convoy stayed under surveillance allowed the Allies to refine their strike plans, coordinate their squadrons, and choose the optimal time for attack. For the first time in the Pacific War, the Allies were poised to deliver a coordinated multi-level assault on a major Japanese reinforcement convoy. Reconnaissance aircraft continued to relay updates throughout the afternoon and into the evening, tracking changes in formation, speed, and course. As night approached, Catalinas assumed the primary surveillance duty, using their long endurance to maintain contact, while the larger bombers returned to base to refuel and prepare for the coming battle. Nightfall transformed the pursuit into a contest of nerves. The Japanese hoped darkness would allow them to break contact, while the Allies relied on the Catalina's ability to follow dim silhouettes and faint wakes under the moonlight. The convoy's destroyers periodically deployed smokescreens to obscure their movements, forcing Allied crews to adjust their tracking patterns and rely heavily on intuition and experience. Yet the Catalinas clung to the convoy with quiet persistence, reporting positions at regular intervals. The Japanese captains realized that their efforts to shake surveillance were failing. They altered course slightly, hoping to confuse the tracking aircraft, but the Allies quickly adjusted. In the dim glow of the moon, the convoy pressed on, its crews unable to rest as the sound of distant aircraft engines drifted intermittently across the water. As the long night gave way to another dawn, the stage for the coming battle was firmly set. The convoy was still hundreds of kilometers from Leh, trapped under the watchful eyes of Allied reconnaissance. Allied commanders, now armed with precise knowledge of the convoy's route, speed, and composition, were preparing to unleash the full strength of their air forces. The reconnaissance operations, hours of monotonous flying, relentless searching, and constant reporting, had achieved their purpose. They had found the convoy, shadowed it, and delivered the intelligence needed for a devastatingly effective strike. The Japanese, meanwhile, braced themselves for the attack they now knew was inevitable. The clouds that had once offered hope for concealment now parted to reveal a sky filled with distant aircraft, harbingers of the destruction that awaited them in the hours to come. The hunt was over. The battle was about to begin. Dawn on March 3, 1943, unveiled a sky washed in pale gold over the Bismarck Sea. But beneath its calm veneer, the stage was set for one of the most catastrophic defeats the Japanese Navy would suffer in the entire Pacific War. As the convoy continued its desperate push toward Leh, the air above them thickened with the distant hum of engines, signals that the Allied air forces were converging for the decisive blow. For Japan's commanders, who had hoped their night transit and early morning cloud cover would shield them, the realization struck too late. The Allies had found them, tracked them, and were now preparing to unleash a level of coordinated air power that would redefine the nature of naval warfare. Allied aircraft launched from multiple bases, Port Moresby, Milne Bay, and forward airstrips on New Guinea, flooded into the sky in waves. These formations were not random or scattered. They were the result of meticulous planning driven by the innovative tactics of the U.S. 5th Air Force under General George Kenny and the equally determined Royal Australian Air Force. The attack strategy relied on a mix of medium bombers, heavy bombers, fighters, and most notably, the uniquely trained low-level attack units that would deliver the devastating skip bombing runs. The Japanese convoy, composed of transports weighed down with troops and supplies and escorted by destroyers already strained by constant alertness, now faced a level of pressure for which they were wholly unprepared. The first wave smashed into the convoy with staggering speed. B-17 flying fortresses swept in from high altitude, their bombs falling like steel rain across the formation. Though not always accurate, the psychological effect alone was immense. Transports swerved, escorts maneuvered frantically, and the carefully ordered convoy began to unravel. But the true devastation came moments later as low-flying B-25 Mitchells and Australian Beaufighters roared in at mast height. These aircraft braved a storm of anti-aircraft fire, skimming just above the waves to deliver skip bombs that ricocheted across the sea before slamming into the hulls of their targets. This brutal tactic, refined over months of training, proved lethal. Ships that moments before were cutting through the water now erupted in massive detonations as ammunition stores ignited. Destroyers, battered and now facing overwhelming firepower, struggled to rescue survivors as even they sustained their own hits. The once imposing Japanese reinforcement effort, intended to stabilize the front at Leh, was dissolving into a nightmarish tableau of smoke columns, burning oil slicks, and shattered hulls. By the time the major waves withdrew, the Bismarck Sea had become a floating graveyard. The Japanese suffered staggering losses, both in ships and manpower. Allied air crews, though exhausted, recognized that they had achieved something groundbreaking: the overwhelming destruction of a major naval convoy without a single Allied ship involved. Their tactics, coordination, and innovations in low-level attack methods had completely shifted the dynamics of Pacific warfare. The Japanese Navy, stunned by the scale and speed of the assault, found itself forced to reevaluate the ability of air power to protect or destroy naval operations. The sun was sinking toward the western horizon on March 3, 1943, when the Allies shifted from overwhelming destruction to ruthless pursuit. The Japanese convoy, shattered and burning, was no longer a coherent fighting force, but a scattering of crippled transports, damaged destroyers, oil fires, and desperate survivors clinging to debris. Yet the battle was far from over. For the U.S. 5th Air Force and the Royal Australian Air Force, the primary objective was not simply to sink ships. It was to prevent Japan from reinforcing Leh at any cost. Every soldier who reached the shore would fight again, prolong the New Guinea campaign, and threaten Allied footholds. Thus began one of the most controversial and relentless pursuits of the Pacific War. As smoke drifted across the Bismarck Sea, Allied reconnaissance aircraft moved in to identify damaged vessels attempting escape. Some transports, half submerged but still afloat, tried to limp toward the coastline. Destroyers like Asashio and Arashio turned back repeatedly, attempting to rescue survivors while fending off strafing attacks. The waters churned with the cries of hundreds of Japanese soldiers thrown into the sea, many covered in fuel or injured by explosions. Still, Allied air crews pressed forward. They understood the brutal arithmetic of the Pacific Front. Every rescued Japanese soldier meant another potential attacker storming Allied positions in the jungles of New Guinea. Throughout the afternoon and evening, waves of B-25 Mitchells and Beaufighters swept low across the water, targeting drifting vessels and lifeboats. Their mission was uncompromising: deny the Japanese any chance of reaching land. While heavy bombers returned to base following their earlier assaults, the faster attack aircraft stayed in the fight, diving again and again to suppress destroyer crews and scatter rescue attempts. One transport after another slipped beneath the waves, extinguished by bombs, strafing runs, or the slow collapse of a hull already fatally ruptured. Oil slicks spread for miles. Fires burned through the night. On the morning of March 4, the full extent of the Allied pursuit came into focus. Japanese commanders had believed at least some troops would survive by swimming or drifting to the New Guinea coastline. But Allied patrols had anticipated this. Australian aircraft deployed along the likely drift paths, intercepting clusters of rafts and swimmers. The RAAF crews, hardened by months of brutal fighting, showed no hesitation. Their orders were clear: prevent reinforcements from reaching Lae under any circumstances. Many airmen would later recall these missions as the most harrowing of their careers, not for danger, but for the unyielding nature of the task. Despite these attacks, a handful of Japanese soldiers did manage to reach shore. Some crawled onto remote beaches, half-conscious and burned. Others were picked up by submarines or small craft dispatched from Japanese bases. But the numbers were catastrophically small compared to the nearly 7,000 troops originally bound for Lae. The Allied pursuit had effectively erased an entire reinforcement wave, crippling Japanese operational plans and buying the Allies precious breathing room in the New Guinea theater. By the end of March 4, the Bismarck Sea was eerily quiet. The smoke had thinned, the fires diminished, and only scattered wreckage and bodies were made to mark the site of one of Japan's worst naval disasters. The Allied pilots returned to base, exhausted, but aware that their relentless pressure had achieved a decisive victory. Their actions ensured that the Japanese army could not reinforce its collapsing position in the Huon Gulf, paving the way for future Allied advances. The final pursuit phase of the Battle of the Bismarck Sea remains one of the most debated operations of the air war, hailed by some as a necessary act in the brutal logic of total war, criticized by others for its mercilessness. But in strategic terms, its impact was undeniable. By preventing thousands of Japanese troops from ever reaching the battlefield, the Allies had decisively shaped the future course of the New Guinea campaign. The waters where the convoy sank became not only a graveyard of ships and men, but a symbol of a new kind of warfare, one in which the pursuit was as vital as the initial strike, and where control of the skies meant control of the war itself. The smoke of the Bismarck Sea had barely begun to drift apart when the broader echoes of the battle rippled across the Pacific. The destruction of the Japanese convoy was more than a tactical victory. It was a strategic turning point that altered the momentum of the New Guinea campaign and reshaped the Japanese military's understanding of air power, logistics, and the increasingly desperate trajectory of their war effort. In Tokyo, the news of the annihilation stunned the Imperial General Headquarters. Nearly 7,000 troops, desperately needed to reinforce Lae, had been lost, along with 8 transports and 4 destroyers. It was a catastrophe, not simply because of the scale of the losses, but because it revealed a grim new truth. Japan could no longer move forces across contested waters without suffering devastating consequences. In the weeks following the battle, Japanese commanders scrambled to evaluate how their convoy had been destroyed so quickly and thoroughly. The conclusion was inescapable. Allied air superiority had reached a level that rendered traditional reinforcement operations nearly impossible. The 5th Air Force's success in coordinating high-altitude bombing, skip bombing, and strafing attacks demonstrated a mastery of combined air tactics that Japan could neither replicate nor effectively counter. The battle became a case study in the power of air dominance, shifting naval doctrine throughout the Pacific. From this moment onward, Japanese convoys avoided daylight movements, hugging coastlines, or relying on smaller, fragmented shipments. But these adjustments came too late. The Allies now possessed both the momentum and the means to cut Japan's supply arteries whenever they chose. Allied leaders, meanwhile, recognized the Battle of the Bismarck Sea as validation of their evolving air strategy. General George Kenney and his staff viewed the victory not as a one-time triumph, but as proof that aggressive air power, applied with innovation and precision, could neutralize major naval movements without committing a single Allied warship. The battle vindicated the development of skip bombing, solidified the role of low-level attack aircraft, and demonstrated that well-coordinated air assaults could accomplish what even a superior navy might struggle to achieve. Military planners across the Pacific studied the events of March 1943 closely, adjusting their strategies to amplify the strengths of air forces in future campaigns, from New Guinea to the Philippines. On the ground in New Guinea, the consequences of the battle were immediate and profound. With reinforcements annihilated and supply lines shattered, Japanese troops at Lae and Salamaua faced increasing shortages of food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Morale plummeted as soldiers realized that no help was coming. The isolation of Lae opened the door for subsequent Allied offensives, including Operation Postern, the amphibious and airborne assault that would ultimately capture the city. Every step the Allies took up the New Guinea coastline from mid-1943 onward was shaped by the knowledge that Japan could not replenish its forces. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had effectively amputated Japan's ability to defend its forward positions. Beyond the immediate battlefield, the psychological impact reverberated across both sides. For the Allies, particularly Australian forces who had fought grueling campaigns against well-supplied Japanese troops in previous months, the victory offered renewed confidence and momentum. Newspapers across Australia hailed it as one of the greatest air victories of the war, a turning point that brought the prospect of offensive action closer than ever. For Japan, however, the psychological blow was profound. The aura of invincibility that had accompanied Japanese forces during the early months of the Pacific War was fading rapidly. The New Guinea front, once seen as a potential staging point for pressure against Australia, now looked increasingly like a dead end. As analysts and military historians reviewed the battle in the years that followed, many came to view it as a pivotal example of modern warfare's transformation. The Bismarck Sea marked a shift away from traditional naval engagements toward a future in which fleets could be destroyed not by other ships, but by aircraft acting with precision, coordination, and overwhelming force. It foreshadowed later air-sea battles from the Philippine Sea to Leyte Gulf, in which air power would dictate the terms of engagement. The principles demonstrated by Allied forces, flexibility, innovation, and the willingness to adapt tactics to new technologies, became hallmarks of the Pacific theater's later stages. Even decades later, the battle remains a powerful symbol of how the tide of war can turn in a single day of decisive action. The waters where the convoy fell still rest over the remains of ships and men whose fate shaped the course of the Pacific War. For the Allies, it was a triumph of ingenuity and determination. For Japan, it was a painful reminder of the price of overextension and the rising dominance of Allied air power. And for historians, it stands as one of the clearest demonstrations of how strategy, technology, and human resolve can converge to change the destiny of nations.